Welcome back to Church in the World. It is Sunday. It is the fifth Sunday of Easter, and we are closing out our fourth week, and we're entering our fifth week of this series. Today, we're going to have a little appendix episode, and as I always do, this is not based on one of the social statements. It's based instead on a confessional document in the ELCA and the Lutheran Church. Today, what I want to look at, again, we're going to look at the Large Catechism, and I want to look at the fifth commandment. I think this will interest you. You see, the fifth commandment, now the way Martin Luther numbers the commandments, because you may have encountered different numberings. Luther numbers the commandments as follows. You shall have no other gods. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You shall honor your father and your mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's spouse. You shall not covet. 10. You shall not covet your neighbor's other properties. The fifth commandment then is you will not kill or you will not murder, depending on how you translate it and what you mean by either of those terms. It's an interesting concept. And Luther goes on at great length in the start of the Large Catechism section on this commandment about what that means and who this applies to. And Luther is very clear. When a parent or government or any person in authority is engaging in some sort of violent conduct towards one who is in rebellion, that's not murder. That's not killing. That's them doing what's necessary to establish order. Now, this, of course, comes and bites us a little bit in the butt in things like the Peasants' Revolt or in other later ideas, circumstances where really some sort of resistance to the government is necessary. But on the other hand, what Luther is intending to say there, because he does say it elsewhere in the Large Catechism, is when a person in authority violates the trust given to them and in their office, right? When a parent doesn't feed their child, right? They no longer have the right to beat the child. They're not acting as parent. They don't get to pick and choose what their responsibilities and powers are. You're a parent or you're not. In the same way, the government, when the people are starving, the government doesn't really have the right to suppress a revolt in order to defend itself and its privileges and powers because it's not doing its job. And that's very important to understand. But what I want to focus on is something after that. So what Luther says in this, to summarize this, Luther says we should not harm anyone either by hand or by deed. We should not use our tongue to advocate or advise harming anyone. We should neither use nor sanction any means or methods whereby anyone may be mistreated. So there goes racism, by the way, or sexism or any other such discrimination. Our heart should harbor no hostility or malice against anyone in a spirit of anger or hatred. Right? And this is mostly he's been following Jesus' exegesis of this commandment. You have heard of old that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister is guilty of murder. Right? So Luther's drawing on that. But then he goes on and he says, in the second place, this commandment is violated not only when we do evil, but also when we have the opportunity to do good to our neighbors and to prevent, protect, and save them from suffering bodily harm or injury, but fail to do so. If you send a naked person away when you could clothe him, you have let him freeze to death. If you see anyone who is suffering from hunger and do not feed her, you have let her starve. Likewise, if you see anyone who is condemned to death or in similar peril and do not save him, although you have means and ways to do so, you have killed him. It will be of no help for you to use the excuse that you did not assist their deaths by word or deed, for you have withheld your love from them and robbed them of the kindness by means of which their lives might have been saved. Therefore, God rightly calls all persons murderers who do not offer counsel or assistance to those in need and peril of body and life. I picked this passage to talk about this week because it's really, really important for us to understand the basis of the Lutheran theological commitments around things like economic life. And that is based in the Ten Commandments and Luther's exposition of them, that the commandments have a not this, but this aspect to them for Lutherans, right? If we are never to murder, it means we are always to instead promote life. Now, we heard about that in our statements on the death penalty and our statements on abortion. And that also draws from this same idea. But here, it's very, very important to hear that it's not just about physically killing somebody or somebody physically dying. Someone suffering extreme want, someone who does not have enough. When we neglect them, we are violating the commandments, because the commandments that forbid us from taking from them are the same commandments that command us to provide what we can for those in need. That's the fifth commandment. Let's see if the seventh commandment on you are not to steal says anything. Let's see. This commandment is very far-reaching, as we have shown. It is necessary to emphasize and explain it to the common people in order that they may be restrained in their wantonness, and that the wrath of God always be kept before their eyes and impressed upon them. For we must preach this not to Christians, but chiefly to knaves and scoundrels, though it would certainly be more fitting if the judge, the jailer, or the hangman did the preaching. Let all people know, then, that it is their duty on pain of God's displeasure not to harm their neighbors, to take advantage of them, or to defraud them by any faithless or underhanded business transaction. Cheating in business or depriving somebody of more than what they're receiving is worth is stealing. Much more than that, they are also obligated, that is everyone, is obligated faithfully to protect their neighbor's property and to promote and further their interests, especially when they get money, wages, and provisions for doing so, especially employees and those who are hired to protect property. Okay. Let's see here. And he goes on. Those who will disregard this commandment may indeed get by and avoid the hangman, but they will not escape God's wrath and punishment. Luther has some spice to him that is unfamiliar to modern American Christians, but this is how he talked all the time. Though they may pursue their defiant and arrogant course for a long time, they will still remain tramps and beggars and will suffer all kinds of troubles and misfortunes. Now you ought to take care of your master or mistress's property, let's say your employer's property, which enables you to stuff your craw and belly, but you take your pay like a thief and expect to be honored like a nobleman. Many of you are even insolent towards your employers and unwilling to do them the favor and service of protecting them from loss. Look at what you gain. When you acquire property yourself and sit in your own house, which God will help you acquire to your undoing, there will come a day of reckoning and retribution. 30 times over you will have to repay every penny of loss or harm you have caused. Luther very much believed this, that when we engage in unjust economic practices as employers or employees, we're going to suffer bad consequences because we sow the seeds of real instability and harm. The same thing will happen to artisans or day laborers. God will not forget his commandment and will pay them what they deserve. He will not hang them on a green gallows, but on a dry one. But then, and this is very important, because so far he's talked about employers and people who are paid for their labor or for their production. So look what he does next. The same fate will befall those who turn the free public market into nothing but a carrion pit and a robber's den. The poor are defrauded every day, and new burdens and higher prices are imposed. They all misuse the market in their own arbitrary, defiant, arrogant way, as if it were their privilege and right to sell their goods as high as they please without any criticism. We will stand by and let such people fleece, grab, and hoard, but we will trust God who takes matters into his own hands. After you have scrimped and saved for a long time, God will pronounce a blessing over you. May your grain spoil in the barn, your beer in the cellar, your cattle perish in the stall. Yes, where you have cheated and defrauded anyone out of a gulden, that is to say, of one coin. Your entire hoard ought to be consumed by rust so that you will never enjoy it. Okay? In short, no matter how much you steal, be certain that twice as much will be stolen from you. Anyone who robs and takes things by violence and dishonesty must put up with someone else who plays the same game. Because everyone robs and steals from everyone else, God has mastered the art of punishing one thief by means of another. Otherwise, where would we find enough gallows and ropes? But beware, anyone who is willing to learn should know that this is God's commandment, that God does not want it to be considered a joke. We will put up with those of you who despise, defraud, steal, and rob us. We will endure your arrogance and show forgiveness and mercy as the Lord's Prayer teaches us. The upright, meanwhile, will have enough, and you will hurt yourself more than anyone else. But beware of how you deal with the poor. There are many of them now who must live from hand to mouth. If you act as if everyone has to live by your favor, if you skin and scrape them right down to the bone, if you arrogantly turn away those who need your aid, they will go away wretched and dejected, and because they can complain to no one else, they will cry out to heaven. Beware of this, I repeat, as if it were the devil himself. Such sighs and cries are no laughing matter, but will have an effect too great for you and all the world to bear. For they will reach God, who watches over the poor, troubled hearts, and he will not leave them unavenged. Luther, then, in these two commandments, lays it out pretty thoroughly. Economic life, right, is a part of not murdering, right, and ways to provide and protect those, and it's a way of avoiding stealing. So when we find ourselves making unusual amounts of profits, we have the opportunity to redistribute that wealth and resources so that we're not found guilty of stealing, but instead are generous with what God has entrusted to us. And Luther's very clear. We've got to be really careful when we have enough to give to the poor and choose not to, no matter who we are, because they have not enough, and we then run the risk of having too much. And so that's one of the reasons why that economic life statement is so important for us to understand. Martin Luther is not saying you have to create some sort of gigantic NGO or social safety net, though I don't think he would have necessarily opposed such things. It would have been impossible for him to imagine such a thing as somebody writing in the 16th century in Europe, and somebody who was not a specialist in economic theory at that. Note also that Luther kind of predates capitalism, so he wouldn't have understood a lot of the things we deal with in daily life. But what he did understand is the Ten Commandments, and the fact that in all times of history, there are those who don't have enough and those who have too much, right? Economic disparity. And Luther, like many Christian teachers before and since, is saying when there's economic disparity and the poor are suffering, and those who have, you, whoever you are, if you have something your poor neighbor needs and you do not give it, you have stolen it from them and you have harmed them. And if they suffer sickness, harm, or death because of you clinging to your possessions, you then become not guilty not just of stealing but of murder. And that's really serious stuff that we need to consider as we think about the choices we make in our economic lives together, right? Scary because Luther is pretty scary in a lot of the ways he writes, but also really inspiring because it frees us from a lot of the kind of baggage around our political system and our culture, right? It gets us out of our own places and heads into some different language. I hope it's been useful for you. It's always useful for me to remember that when the poor cry, God is especially listening to them because no one else is. I wonder if that's a sermon that you could preach to somebody who's poor that you know or that you meet. I wonder if you might be poor and need to hear that in some way. I wonder if you needed to hear that the commandments of not stealing and not murdering are not just don't take anything that's not yours and don't hurt anybody, but help everyone avoid harm and be generous with what God has given you because God was generous with you in giving it. Well, I hope that that was at least interesting as an appendix and kind of more confessional basis of what we've been talking about the past week in terms of peace and in terms of economic life. In the coming week, we're going to move into the new millennium. We've finished with the economic life statement of 1999. We're going to move forward from there. I hope you will join me as we continue. There are a number of very interesting things ahead, and I believe this coming week, I don't remember the first statement we have, but the second statement for the second half of the week, we'll be looking at the human sexuality statement, I believe, and that's really important. And the first, I think it must be then on, no, not criminal justice, because that's later, right before sexism. I don't recall. So we'll just have to be surprised tomorrow. But I hope you'll tune in, and I hope you'll post your questions in your comments. Reach out to me anytime. Join us for Sunday morning worship today. If you've missed us already, then that recording will be up on the same YouTube channel, and I hope you'll pray with us today. Well, join me this week, and until then, God bless.